Hello, everyone. If I could get your attention, please. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. My name is Lindsay Holmgren. I'm a professor in the Faculty of Management, and I am acting director right now of the Laidley Center for Business Ethics, which brings us this wonderful speaker we have today, Joellen Posner. Before we get started, I'm just going to start with a land acknowledgement. So Joellen Posner joined Santa Clara University's Levy School of Business in the fall of 2016. Before that, she was on faculty at the Haas School of Business, University of California, Berkeley. Her research focuses on questions of organizational ethics, corporate governance, social evaluation, and social movements. She is interested in the processes through which we make sense of and evaluate others, particularly around instances of wrongdoing and scandal. The second area of interest investigates the intersection of social movements and markets, including research on movements that promoted organic food, bean-to-bar chocolate, microbreweries, and low-power FM radio. Finally, she has a particular interest in organizational misconduct, specifically the ways in which misconduct at the organizational level impacts top management and boards of directors at the companies involved. Posner graduated with a PhD in Management and Organizations from the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern University. She holds an MBA from the Stern School of Business, New York University, a master's in economics from the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins, and a BSFS in international economics from the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. Thank you very much, Joellen, for being here with us today. And I'd like to say that today, Joellen is keen to hear what your questions are. She's keen to understand what you think about when you concern yourselves with ethics in the context of business. The question is this an oxymoron? Do we think this is an oxymoron? She would like to hear from you and wants to create a good deal of space for all of you to pose questions and engage with her work. But we have prepared some questions in advance so that we can get the ball rolling here on this dialogue and hear from Joellen. So I'm also going to turn it over to Joellen first. She's going to situate for you a little bit her own work and her historical reasons for being so engaged in these concerns that are of particular importance to all of the people in this room. So, Joellen, share with us.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. And thanks to everybody for coming. I was not expecting this large a crowd. So I did not start off, as you heard, as an ethicist at all. I don't even think of myself as an ethicist now, but I do think about questions of right and wrong quite a bit. And the journey that I took to getting my PhD and starting a research career around issues of wrongdoing and social evaluation and things like that, started in my prior life as a development economist. So my undergraduate degree and my first master's degree were in economic transition in Eastern Europe and Russia. And I worked for a couple of years in Moscow in the mid to late 90s as a program officer for a nonprofit that does training and consulting for the financial services sectors of transition economies. So at that time, we were big in Eastern Europe. Now they're still around and doing really well in largely in Africa and the Far East. And the Russian transition was really a fascinating time. And I spent these 2 years in Russia with really good Russian language skills and a lot of cultural knowledge, and I have family ties there, and thought I kind of knew what the world was like as a 25-year-old, which turns out you don't usually. And I had this really formative experience that it took me a couple of years to process. So in Russia, in Moscow, certainly in the late 90s, there was kind of Uber before Uber. It was Uber without an app, Uber before cell phones. So when you needed a ride, you never got into an actual taxi because that was dangerous. But what you would do is hitchhike, right? So you'd like put your hand up by the side of the road and wait for somebody to stop, and then you'd tell them where you were going, and ask them how much they would charge you to take you there. And this was like super normal. You're like, it feels dicey. I would not recommend doing this to like in any other place, maybe even not there. But that's how we got around. And my Russian was really good, but I still had a slight American accent, and I had like a very Russian-looking coat and hat. So it took people a little while to kind of place me when I would get into their car. And most people would ask me where I was from and what I was doing. And when I explained this nonprofit that I was working for, they kind of like their eyes glazed over. Which seemed reasonable. But this one driver, when I explained that we were helping with, the central bank and the securities exchange to become enmeshed in the global financial system, got really excited and had a lot of follow-up questions. And one of them was, are you teaching them the real rules or the official rules? And I was like, I don't think there are two different sets of rules. Like, that didn't compute to me. And he articulated this very well-developed and completely anathema to me idea that there were official rules that were essentially for suckers, and then there was a set of like hidden imputed rules that if you had access to were actually the way to do business and to get ahead. And I was, a 25-year-old kind of good girl, that's not the way I ever operated in the world. And it really took me a couple of years to realize that not only was he very accurately describing the way things worked in his part of the world, but really accurately describing the way things work in many parts of the world. There is a sense in which the real rules are slightly decoupled from the official rules. And there are ways of operating that might be more ethical or less ethical, might get you ahead or might get you in trouble. And part of our enterprise as people in the world is to make sense of how those rules get assigned, how the consequences get assigned, how we make sense of, how we evaluate others, how others evaluate us. And it doesn't always, those evaluations don't always follow the official rules. So that, when I, a couple of years later, started working on a PhD, became the kind of foundation for my interest in organizational misconduct and the idea that not everybody gets punished for not following the rules, and not everybody gets ahead for following the rules. And there's a lot of space where we have, through social interaction, to make sense of and to reinterpret the kind of official line.
That's great. Thank you very much. Actually, it causes me to want to maybe mix up the order of these questions here, because I'm actually thinking, in light of what you described there, that experience for you, one question we have was, we sort of assume that most people would be like your 25-year-old self, that most people set out, I think we mostly agree, we set out to sort of follow the rules we all believe we're participating in. But then that doesn't necessarily happen in practice. So the question is, how does it happen, or do you think about how it happens that people get derailed from this initial plan to be ethical business people?
Yeah, and I think we can broaden that to just being ethical people, right? So I have a pithy way of describing the way I think the world actually works around ethics, which is that I think most of us think of ourselves as good people, and most of us want to be good people, but that most of us don't spend too much time thinking about it. And that self-concept, right, that self-definition of I am a good person, is enough to carry us forward without spending a lot of time thinking about it. Now, when I say good people, I mean something very specific. I'm not a philosopher. I don't have training in philosophy. So like when I talk about ethics, I'm not into deontology and all of that kind of stuff. I think that's really important, but it's not my training, and it's not the way my brain works. So the way I think about what it means to be good is to act in consistency with our own personal values. And to do that, and to be a consistently good person, we need to actually know what our values are. And that's the part where I think people make the first misstep or take a shortcut, right? We're trained by our parents, by our early schooling, by our communities, by our religious beliefs, whatever kind of exposure we have in early childhood and young adulthood. We develop a set of values, and then we don't spend, on average, a lot of time really thinking about them. So if I asked you to articulate what it was that you valued most, you could probably come up with a couple of things really quickly that almost everybody would share. So you would probably name honesty, or integrity, or fairness, or kindness, right? Is one of those resonating with everybody? But those are really important, and those are the kinds of things that I try to teach my own children. But they're also kind of generic, and they don't always have a lot of meaning, right? Integrity is kind of something that we know kind of what it means, but what does it really mean, and how do I do it? And then there are values that we probably have that are a little bit deeper and more unique, but it takes us some time to think about them and to name them, and then to really name what they mean, how we could act in accordance with those values. And so if we fail to do that, then how do we act consistently with values? So we then go around life thinking, well, I'm a good person and I have values. And then we come to value-laden decision points, and we might not stop to think about how consistent any course of action might be with our deeper values because we haven't spent the time naming them, right? So there are lots of kind of slips where we can fall, even though our true intention is to be good, is to do good, is to make good decisions.
That's really interesting. I'm questioning in my own mind, does that mean we have to carve out time? Is it a question of time, carving out time for thinking about our value priorities, right? And that's one of the challenges in business time and in life, time paucity, right?
Absolutely. I think we have to spend time in it, really deep time in it, because we can come up with very quick answers that are, satisficing, right? That are good enough answers. But that doesn't really do much to help us discern in real life.
Right. Thank you very much. So now I'm going to ask the question that is on the tip of all of our tongues. Is business ethics an oxymoron? So very seriously, is it, or are business and ethics inherently in conflict with each other? Or are they not? If not, how not? What do you think about these questions?
I don't think they are in conflict. I don't think it's revolutionary to be a good person and to make good decisions. And if we're making good decisions, again, value-consistent decisions, then the business that we engage in can very easily be ethical. So we need to do the thinking that allows us to get there. And I think business ethics education is so important to giving us access to the kinds of situations that we might find ourselves in unprepared, right? The first time we come to an obviously ethical dilemma, we often feel overwhelmed because we haven't gone through the process of thinking about, how I would go about making this decision. So the business education can make such a huge difference. But I think I fundamentally believe in the goodness of people. I come from a starting point that we all are acting in good faith the majority of the time. I mean, there are like 5% of us who are sociopaths, so like it's 1 in 20 of you. And we can't really account for those, but also sociopaths are pretty good at faking it, so they can be ethical too. Those aren't incompatible states. But not only do I think it's reasonable to assume that most people are trying to make good decisions in businesses, I also think it's reasonable to assume that businesses are trying to do good. And I don't mean just have you all watched the show Silicon Valley? No? Okay.
Yes, I have.
Okay. Maybe oldies like us, or maybe a generational thing. Well, Silicon Valley is this HBO show about startup culture in Silicon Valley from, 5 or 6 years ago. Mm-hmm. And there's a fantastic line where somebody's like, a big tech CEO is having a snit, and he says, I don't want to live in a world where anybody is trying to make the world a better place than I am, right? Like, I want to be the best at making the world a better place. So, like, that's not the kind of ethical business that I think is important. Like, that's kind of just blowing smoke. But I think it's reasonable to assume that one can have a successful business or a successful business career while trying to put good into the world. Most of us get into whatever line of work we're in because we're trying to produce something that creates value. And that value can be more than just money, right? I don't want to denigrate making money because money also helps people. But there are lots of ways to engage with our work that really are truly aimed at putting good things into the world, good products, good services, good ideas, and that is not incompatible with being profitable. It's not incompatible with growth. It's not incompatible with success. I think we get into trouble when we start defining success purely in economic terms, and if we ignore the kind of social value, the use value, and the ethical value that we put into the world, then we're missing out on opportunities to really benchmark our success and celebrate it.
Okay, great, thank you. So to sort of piggyback on that, what are some examples of, quote, ethical businesses, unquote, maybe that aren't obviously, this is a social business, a socially engaged business. What are some of the signs of a business that is conducting itself ethically? And perhaps what are the telltale signs of a business that might be in danger of falling prey to unethical business practices? Sort of combining a couple questions.
It's complicated. Do you know that the business school management professor's answer is always it depends, right? Right. So there are lots of contingencies here, but I guess there are all kinds of businesses that really are trying to do good. One of the industries that I've been studying for the last couple of years is bean-to-bar chocolate. Is anybody familiar with that industry? So you might know Tony's Chocolonely is like a big Dutch brand that they must sell here. It's global. Do you have it? Yeah. I have some for tomorrow, not Tony's, but others. And this is like small batch chocolate, craft-produced chocolate that is, on the consumer-facing side, is really intended to bring high-quality, tasty confections that are kind of better for you because they don't contain all kinds of, pesticides and things like that. And are made from high quality beans, and they give you a distinctive flavor. It's like, like specialty coffee or specialty or microbrews or things like that. And you can imagine a world in which that was the beginning and end of the industry. But in fact, this industry was founded by people who saw that cacao was being farmed generally on very small plots of land by subsistence farmers with a lot of slave labor and child labor and a really exploitative commodities market. And there was no agents. Most people who farm cacao have never tasted chocolate. So their goal was to improve the lives and the kind of triple bottom line effects of cacao farming by paying a weight or a rate for the cacao that reflected the commodity use, the use value of the cacao. Mm-hmm. And insulated people from the vagaries of the commodities market, they work with farmers to teach them to use fewer pesticides and better, kind of more sustainable strains of cacao, and fewer fertilizers, and to build infrastructure locally. So it's not exactly a social enterprise, right? It's not the goal of the business, or the business of the business is not to do good, but the way that they do business is built around the idea that values can come first, and you can create a sustainable business that's profitable, that makes something delicious and wonderful, that can serve both ends of that supply chain, from the farmers to the end consumers, and everybody is benefiting from it. So that's like very niche, right? But there are all kinds of businesses where the kind of good, the value of the goods that they're putting out into the world are structured in an ethical way, and that are intended to make people's lives better. I was just on a call this week with the CEO of a company called Life Guides, which sounds a little woo-woo, but it's a really interesting startup in the mental health space, online mental health space, where it's kind of like a matching service, like a Match.com for friends' advice. So I think their slogan is something like more casual than therapy, more qualified than your friends. So it matches you with people who have gone through, is that cheesy or is it good? It's good. I think it's pretty good. They match, you kind of fill out a form and say, like, here's the thing that I'm struggling with, and they match you with or give you a range of people that might have had similar experiences so that you can talk to each other. It makes money. It's got good funding. It's well-resourced. It has the potential to make a lot of money. Their goal is to go public. And their business is putting good into the world, right? And it's hard to, I can't promise that nobody there is an unethical actor, but it's easy to see that kind of enterprise is organized around values and ethics, and so we can approach the whole enterprise of doing business from a position of what good am I bringing to the world.
Thanks very much. So here's one that I found particularly interesting. What are some of the main, and I think this would be interesting for many of the students in the room, what are some of the main challenges that someone newly appointed to right the ship in a company that has an unethical culture might have to face?
All of them. Everything.
Yeah.
It's so hard. Okay, so organizational culture is very sticky, right? How do we do things here? What are the rules of the game? It's not just the official rules in the employee handbook. It's also the way the office is physically laid out, right? The words that we use to talk to each other, the kind of rules of thumb that we use to guide decision making. And if there isn't a sense of ethics and morality built into that culture from the beginning, then it's hard to imbue morality or ethicality into that culture. But I think that, you and I were talking before about how change in top leadership really can have a very quick trickle-down effect. So the challenge, I think, is finding the right advocates, and actually this is probably no different from any other kind of form of organizational change, is finding the right advocates, the right teammates within the organization that can help you articulate values more explicitly, find meaningful practices that allow you to live those values more consistently, and to not get caught up in the way we've always done things. One of the things I've been thinking about a lot recently, I've been asked to do some teaching just randomly or unexpectedly about culture of innovation, mindset of innovation. And one of the questions that I've been posing to the companies that I've been working with on this is, what would it take to get you to ask the question, what if, instead of why? Right? So part of what keeps us mired in our old-fashioned or dysfunctional ways of doing things is that it's hard to anticipate, it's hard to visualize what doing something differently might look like. And if we kind of create an environment where it's comfortable, where it's safe to ask, what if? What if we, didn't focus on stock price for the next couple of quarters? What if we took a stronger stance with our suppliers and asked them to behave more ethically, or chose more ethical suppliers, for example? What if we decided to forego bonuses and return some value to workers? All of those kinds of questions, I think, can lead us to a more ethical way of engaging in business on the day-to-day. But it doesn't happen unless we let our imaginations run wild a little bit, and that requires a really intentional approach to change.
Thanks very much. I'm reminded of something one of my students said once when I posed a question about whether or not business could look a particular way in the future, and most of the class said, well, that's not possible. And the student's response was, why not? Right?
Isn't that such a powerful question?
Yeah.
I actually had a conversation with a friend recently. She works for a really well-funded startup and has done amazingly well. And as part of her work, she's written a book, and she's now on a book tour, and she's having all these exciting opportunities. And we had the opportunity to catch up over lunch. And I asked her what she was thinking about doing next, because writing a book is it's a big milestone, and then you kind of have this anticlimactic moment, I imagine. I haven't done it myself, but right, so what's the next challenge that you're going to confront? And she said, well, I have all these ideas about how to move the research that went into this book into different spaces, like, for example, maybe the early childhood education space. And I think that would be really useful. I think the ideas that are here are very powerful. It's all based on empirical research, and it would be wonderful if we could make that happen. And I said, great, how are you going to make that happen? And she said, well, I can't really see how it would make any money, so it's not a business. And I said, why not, right? Why not? What if that was your business? What if making $1 million a year was not your goal in making this business? What if making, I don't know, $100,000 a year was your goal in making this business? Or maybe not even having an income-related goal was the foundation of your business. What if you just wanted to put this work out into the world? And that's a hard thing for a lot of people to imagine, because most of us aren't trained that way, right? Our metric for success is not good.
Absolutely. I actually am tempted to turn it out to the students to ask them to inquire or to share their own experiences regarding how they think their education is shaping the way they're going into the business world, right? And to what extent they find that they can ask what if when they're thinking about their own work. So I would encourage you to be thinking about that. What are some of the processes through which we make sense of and evaluate others, particularly around instances of wrongdoing?
So can I not answer the last part? And
yes, just evaluate others.
So and the reason I say that is I actually am I love wrongdoing. I love scandal. I love, our media team at Santa Clara knows that, like, if anybody does something wrong and gets in trouble, that all the media inquiries come to me because I love talking about it so much. But I actually think we'd maybe talk about it a little bit too much, because what we don't do is celebrate or make sense of or spend time really engaging with what people do right.
Great.
So when we talk about ethics in the business context, we're often talking about ethical breaches instead of celebrating ethical behavior. And I'm doing some research now, some theory building research about the processes through which our individual evaluations of others become social evaluations, right? So when you hear a story on the news about, I don't know, a new company, or maybe a company that got into trouble, you have your own opinion. You maybe, think about it for a few moments, and then eventually, at some point, we can measure that there's a reputational impact of that news item, or a status impact, or a stock market reaction. But there's a big gap between me hearing a news story and the market reacting, right? Even if it's just the market for reputation. And it turns out, or at least my colleagues and I are theorizing, that this has a lot to do with our social interactions, the stimuli to which we're exposed. So which news stations do we listen to? Which social media platforms are we on? And what values do we hold? So again, it comes back to values. And so when we hear about good or bad behavior, we kind of filter it through our own sense of right and wrong, and ask ourselves, like, does this feel consistent with my values, or does it violate values that I hold dear? And then we kind of interact formally, informally, loosely with other people who have similar values, not necessarily intentionally, but just through our day-to-day lives. So maybe you're a part of student clubs, or you're in class with a group of people that you see regularly. You hear the same kinds of ideas coming from your professors, from the newscasters, from influencers. I don't know where do kids get their ideas these days. Is it influencers? Is it the TikTok? Right, and so those stimuli help us make sense of the world, and when we see other people reacting, then we temper our reactions in turn. Okay, so what does this mean for the way that we can actually engage in meaning making? It means that all of us have the opportunity to shape reactions. We can be passive recipients of that influence, or we can kind of frame the narrative a little bit, right? We can say, I have an opinion on this. Actually, I think this is a perfectly reasonable behavior in which to engage. Or I feel that this is morally questionable, and I think it violates my value of human kindness, for example. So it really is a very social process. It's still poorly understood, and I don't know if anybody really cares about social evaluation theory, but I think that we do have an opportunity to exert influence over the way that the people around us make sense of things. And that can have really important impacts. So organizational reputation is consequential to stock price, it's consequential to executives' careers, it's consequential to CEO pay. So, we even though each one of us plays a small role in that process, it's an important one.
Thank you very much. That's great. So here's another one. How can people entering the workforce seek out businesses that take ethics seriously?
This is such a good question. I think that we need to, I generally try to approach the world with an open heart and open eyes, and without a great deal of cynicism. But I think we need to be critical evaluators of the kind of recruiting information that companies put out. So I had this interesting experience a couple of years ago at Santa Clara. We had a panel that I helped organize on diversity and inclusion efforts in recruiting. And we were in a room just like this at round tables, and I was sitting at a table with an undergrad senior who asked the last question of the event, and he said something about, like, how do I know that companies really care about me? And whatever, I can't remember what the answers were, but afterwards, everybody was getting up, and I said, what's motivating this question exactly? And he said, well, I'm a senior, I'm graduating, I'm looking for jobs, and I'm trying to understand, what are the things that companies are using to tell me how much they're willing to invest in me, how much they value me. And I said, what do you think those things are? And he said, well, I like it when they give us snacks. I like it when there's ping pong. If you can bring your dog to work, that shows that they really care about you as a whole person. And I got really upset. And I said, that's not what that means, my friend. And he said, what do you mean? I said, well, what that means is if they're offering you snacks and letting you bring your dog to work and doing your dry cleaning for you, what that means is that they don't want you to ever leave the office, right? What that means is that if you have to go home and walk your dog, you might take an extra 10 minutes of break, or you might sit down and listen to music for a few moments and have a moment of peace to yourself. Or you might realize that you have to get home to walk your dog, and so you're going to leave at 7 instead of at 9. And he literally started waving his hands in the air, and he goes, I'm just a philosophy major. I don't know about all of that. But I do just believe that they're telling me the truth. And I was shocked. Shouldn't philosophy majors have better critical thinking skills than that? So I guess my first point is we shouldn't take those things at face value. What does it really mean, right? What does that benefits package really mean functionally? And what does that functional meaning say about how companies feel about you? So it starts with the kind of moral contract that you're engaging with, that you're entering into with the company that might be recruiting you. I also think it's important to look with a critical eye at what the company's websites and corporate communications say. Do the things that are coming out of organizational spokespeople's mouths match the values that are listed on the organizational website? Can you find news items where you seeing behavior that's consistent with those stated values, or are you seeing a lot of inconsistency? And if there's a lot of inconsistency, is it because people made mistakes or bad things happened accidentally, or is it because they don't really live those values? So there's a lot of kind of reading between the lines and triangulating from multiple sources that we need to do to really interrogate, like, is this an ethical organization, or is this an organization that has a good corporate communications person? Well, those two things aren't incompatible, right? But there has to be kind of meat behind the corporate communication. And the other thing that I think is really important is to know what values you yourself hold. So it goes back to that spending time with ourselves and understanding what it is that we hold dear. Because if we take my premise as true that good decisions, ethical decisions, are value-consistent ones, it's really important that you find a home with people who have values similar to yours. Because then you're going to be able to live out those values comfortably without fear of consequence or reprisal. And if everybody else holds different values from you and is acting in accordance with those values, you're going to feel uncomfortable. You're going to feel unhappy. And it's not going to feel, you're not going to, I don't know, be your best self, whatever the thing that we're looking for is. So I think finding that quote unquote ethical firm starts with interrogating our own values.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. So I think one of the challenges I imagine for young people getting started is, on the one hand, they might find a place that seems to share their values, and then when they get into the organization, they discover that it doesn't. So, and that's a difficult place when you're sort of a lower person in the hierarchy to try to navigate. What kinds of advice would you have for people who find themselves in a situation like this, where they are relying on a particular income or a particular place, but they also find themselves in a location that is incompatible with their values that they didn't recognize previously?
That's a really tough question.
It is.
That's such a tough position. And actually, you and I were talking earlier about spaces that we found ourselves in where that was the case for us, right? Or I shouldn't speak for you, but certainly I found that for myself. The negotiations instructor in me says just constantly work to improve your BATNA. keep the, the concept of BATNA. Have you taken negotiations? Best alternative to a negotiated agreement. So, like, what's the alternative that you have if you can't go forward here? Maintaining strong networks with your classmates, with your faculty, with recruiters who come to campus, so that you can ask others, put out leads for new jobs, is a really important social skill, and I think something that we really often ignore at early stages of our career because we're so excited to get that first job that looks so tempting. But we should constantly kind of keep networks warm. I think the most important thing we can do, though, is to find a mentor with whom we really gel and who shares our values. That might be inside the organization or it might not, so that we can ask them for advice. And if it's somebody that doesn't have control over your outcomes, so much the better, right? So is there a faculty member, somebody from your community, somebody that you've met along the way, maybe friends of your parents who you trust and with whom you feel you share values? Having one of those people to really help guide you through moral dilemmas and be a kind of accurate mirror when you're interrogating yourself and examining, am I making a good decision here? Should I be looking for something else? Is really important, because it's hard to make sense of those kinds of issues on our own, especially before we've accumulated a lot of experience in asking those kinds of questions.
Thanks very much. So for the last question, I'm going to ask, because we are actually getting to the end of our time that we've dedicated, and I want to turn it over to the students. I'm going to ask this general question: what does an ethical business look like?
Yeah,
how would you define it?
Just a business that acts in accordance with its values, I think, is what I try to look for, and I think if you can go through that process of identifying your own values and really looking carefully at what the values of the organization are, you'll find lots and lots of ethical businesses out there.
That's great. Thank you. But I'd like to just end by saying what Professor Posner is talking about here is something in which I think all of us are here because we believe, to at least some extent, that these are the possible ways to understand the role of business and the role of our own lives in business, how our own values can be consistent with the businesses in which we work and the pursuits we undertake, and that maintaining those values and talking about those values inside of the organizations in which we work is a good way to ensure that they take hold and that they continue to inform the way the businesses operate. So that's what JoEllen is doing with her work, and thank you very much, JoEllen, for your work.
Thanks so much for having me. Thanks to everybody for being here.